about the gap that separates military and civilian cultures and the problems it presents to both sides of that divide. Tonight's discussion is especially important because special forces are so widely misunderstood, thanks in part to Hollywood, and in part to our society's almost unconscious belief in the myth of American exceptionalism. Before we start, a quick note of appreciation to Brandon Willits and Words After War for co-sponsoring tonight's panel, to Judith Baumel and Adelphi University's English Department and Collaboration Project for donating this space. Thanks to our brilliant panelists for their generosity. And a special thank you to Consequence's Senior Associate Editor, Catherine Parnell, whose efforts made it possible for us to co-sponsor this event in New York. Thank you. Carpenter was founding editor at Francis Coppola's Zoetrope and deputy publisher of the Paris Review. She has an AB from Princeton University and an MBA from Harvard. She's working on her second book, set in the intelligence community.
Thanks, George. I'm really glad that for this panel, I've been moved from panelist to referee. I'm just going to say a few words about each of the panelists. You all have their bios. If you can't hear me, tell me. I apologize, I have a cold. I'll introduce them, and then I'm going to ask Bob to read a little excerpt from his novel, since part of what we're trying to do tonight is talk about the depiction of this world or these worlds, and we'll get to a definition of what these worlds are in literature. In alphabetical order, Elliot Ackerman is a former CIA paramilitary officer and Marine Corps Special Operations Officer. He is a novelist and essayist based out of Istanbul, whose current work focuses on Syria's civil war and the rise of the Islamic State, which I'm sure we will be talking about. His novel Green on Blue is forthcoming from Scribner in February, and his fiction and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The Daily Beast, and Ecotone, among others. He served 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan and is the recipient of the Silver Star, Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and holds a master's degree in international affairs from the Fletcher School on Diplomacy. Tony Schwalm is the author of The Guerrilla Factory and is a retired lieutenant colonel with the U.S. Army Special Forces. Tony's also going to explain the difference between Special Forces and Special Operations Forces in a minute. Prior to joining Special Forces as a tank company commander in Desert Storm, he was awarded the Bronze Star for Valor. Since 9/11, he has served with U.S. Special Operations Command, which I'm sure he's also happy to talk a bit about, and served as a government civilian, leading a team of social scientists assigned to the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force Afghanistan, which he's also happy to define for you, providing sociocultural analysis to SOF deployed in that war-torn country. Bob Chikochis is the author of The Woman Who Lost Her Soul. I highly recommend this book. Recommend it to all panelists. We're going to open with a reading from this novel, which won the 2014 Dayton Literary Prize for Fiction. Bob is a novelist, essayist, journalist, and educator. His work has received a National Book Award for First Fiction, the Rome Prize in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. The Woman Who Lost Her Soul was a Pulitzer finalist. The Immaculate Invasion, about the 1994 military intervention in Haiti, was a finalist for the New Yorker Magazine Literary Awards for Best Nonfiction Book of the Year, and named a notable book of 1999 by the Times. Bob's op-ed commentaries on the U.S. military, Haiti, and Florida politics have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Bob, would you?
Have you marked someplace different in the text than I have marked? What do you? It looks different. because see where I marked into this much of the book?
Yes, but you
Where
don't
did
have
you
to
mark?
post it. I marked a quote by Solzhenitsyn.
Okay.
So I'm going to read that quote.
Go ahead.
And then I'm going to let you read your excerpts.
You want, yeah, okay. So
Okay.
we're on the same wavelength with the Friends of Golf.
We are,
excerpt.
yes.
Ah.
Yes. So the Solzhenitsyn quote is, "If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" Solzhenitsyn. Bob is going to read an excerpt from him.
Yeah, Lee asked me to read this excerpt because it sort of establishes atmospherics for what then Tony and Elliot and Lee and I will talk about. This is it's a very thin book. This is, you know, just right at the beginning of it, and Master Sergeant Evil Burnett is Special Forces Sergeant, not Sergeant Major, Master Sergeant in Haiti. He's being brought to a golf course in Miami, out of Haiti, to caddy for these guys who call themselves Friends of Golf, and this is that scene, and you'll see what's going on here. But the soldier himself is being, in a very prankful way, being slotted to join Delta Force, which in '94 still was a part of the U.S. Army, where everybody would say, what Delta Force? It doesn't exist. They slipped Evil away from his unit in Haiti and brought him up to Miami for a few hours to caddy for Stephen Chambers, the first of numerous occasions in the following years. Something Chambers said to him that first time put everything in perspective afterward. "We don't fly under the radar, son," he said. "We are the radar. We're not operating with situational values here." True leaders did not look at a fire and ask, "What should I do?" True leaders were those men who know what to do and how to do it, and with or without policy, do it, and so it gets done. And it was to them that Master Sergeant Burnett had always owed his allegiance. You could find them some days between temperate equinoxes on the links outside the District of Columbia, convened on the first tee in these final years of the millennium, chins tucked and heads bowed and testicles snug, smacking their drives 250 yards and beyond toward the middle of the fairway. They made the game look easy. They made the game look easy and natural and powered by grace, dialed into the sweet and the straight. Their balls nested in a little egg-like cluster out at the edge of your vision. It was the kind of perfect placement you get from guidance systems orbiting the planet, and that tempted you to think they had the course wired up. They'd punched in the coordinates. What they called themselves with wry half-smiles was the Friends of Golf, FOG, perhaps an advertent self-parody. A permanent threesome with a rotating fourth, selected guest invited on some other basis than handicaps or dead-eye putting. Although they would not abide hackers, given the tightness of their game. Hackers would be told to pick up their ball at some point along the front nine, or they would pick it up themselves when the scoring became too much to bear. And heaven help you if they caught you cheating. An inevitable reminder of the Commander-in-Chief's sleazy penchant for mulligans. They could not forgive the ineptitude of arrogance, the cavalier stupidity of players who voluntarily exposed their weaknesses, and their commensurate need for forgiveness, and they let themselves be caught. Evil Burnett saw the humor in that, a round-robin contest of the unscrupulous, the sly and the underhanded, the touts and the rogues, fox versus fox. Whatever anybody thought he was, Burnett was not a dumbass, although it took him an extra beat to sniff out what the chefs from FOG had cooking on their collective burners. The three regulars had nicknamed themselves after some of the legends of the sport. Undersecretary Chambers was Arnie. Undersecretary Milliken from DOD was Ben Hogan, of course, and Sammy, after Sam Snead, was the alter ego the player formally attached to the agency, whose real name and title Master Sergeant Burnett was never told and never troubled himself to know. But titles were often misleading in the league where these men played. Their fourth might be anybody with a useful skill set. Lawyers, bankers, congressmen, arms dealers, patriotic celebrities, psychics, moguls from the media or defense industries, lobbyists, syndicate capos, cyber engineers, oilmen, narco-traffickers, professors, contractors or their subs, collectors, retainers, cowboys or cowgirls, call girls, whoever you were. If they needed you, they found a way to work you into the picture. Foregrounds and backgrounds cropped and bleached and classified far beyond mortality. The image simple proof of their existence and nothing more. Anybody who came to them bearing a simplistic back-channel mentality only earned Fogg's derision, since they operated quite a few levels beyond or below or behind that, in an endless hallway of locked and unidentified doors that opened into nothing until one door, in fact, opened into everything. But you were never going to have access to that door. Burnett would learn a few things, though. Arnie was a Roman Catholic, Ben a Southern Baptist, Sammy a Jew for Jesus, who had accepted Christ as the Messiah and been saved. Eventually, Burnett would come to understand the importance of their faith. They were graduates of Yale. He could see how that was important, too. Their vanities starched and pressed just so. They were not grizzled, not brawny or physically intimidating. Chambers was like a silvery elm, and the other two short and sinuous with cabled sheaths of muscle like rock climbers, little guys immune to both weight gain and criticism. The three of them together cast a glinting aura of sunny optimism, come to conquer, the self-confidence of men accustomed to the winner's circle. The world, the friends of golf were fond of saying, is not run from a house on Pennsylvania Avenue. They were the architects of the unseen, the fabrication of interlocking subterranean networks and processes that form the human infrastructure of what are known as deep events. Multi-generational efforts routed together into a fusion that seemed to hold together everything in the cosmos of power, the continuum of power, the throb of ancient algorithms, an almost mystic coming together of forces converging across a grid of specialties. Deep events evolved in deep time and produced tectonic shifts in human affairs. Something happens, something obviously cataclysmic, where even the unexpected was not to be mistaken for a coincidence. There are no coincidences, and everything counts. It all depended on the science of applied pressure and counterpressure, making sure that when things break, nations, ideologies, economies, atoms, they break to your advantage, and break they will. So, what I wanted to say in addressing George for a minute about the power of literature, I just had to speak on this at the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. The community of Dayton was fortunate enough to hold the Dayton Peace Accords in the mid-90s that resolved the Balkan Wars. And Richard Holbrooke, who was the mediator of those accords, when he left Dayton, he said, keep the memory of this moment alive because it's so important. My God, there's so little peace in the world, and we were able to make some of it here. And so the people of Dayton decided they would give a literary award for peace to commemorate those peace accords each year. And I was asked to speak on the power of literature, and the funny thing is that the bad guys know the power of literature. The good guys sometimes just shrug, and especially newspaper editors, like, literature? You want us to have a book review page? Are you kidding? But the bad guys know the power of literature. That's why writers are the first to go in any society that's tipping over towards some control, some totalitarianism. So the writers go into exile, or they go to jail, or they go into the grave.
Why do the bad guys know?
What are the bad guys?
Why do the bad guys know?
That literature is subversive, that literature
But
speaks
why do they know? Why
truth
don't
to
the good
power,
guys know?
because it threatens them. And so here's the deal. The afterlife of a war is a book. After all the combatants are dead, after poppies have grown over the battlefields, there's the book. In every great book about war says one thing. It says, stop. Stop. And you can't hide for that. That's the only accountability, basically, that lasts through time, that survives time. Ask Julius Caesar if you can hide from literature. You can't. It's the only thing I know of that has some staying power of accountability. And of course, really, writers have big mouths. People in power don't like big mouths, even here in America. Have you noticed? So, anyways, that's what I wanted to say in response to George.
Thank you. No, thank you. I thought maybe Elliot and Tony could talk a little bit about their response to what Bob read, if any of that echoed for you in a certain way, and as you are thinking about writing your own books, what you think about this concept of after the war comes the book, and why that has to be before we get into special operations forces, since we're on literature.
Well, the book I was thinking of when you were saying that is one by T.R. Fehrenbach. It's called This Kind of War. And the subtitle of that is A Study in Unpreparedness. And generals and they don't say it blithely. I have not met anyone who said this blithely, but they will all admit that the United States swaps blood for time whenever there's a conflict. We really don't know what to do. And then we bemoan all the people that we died because we were doing it wrong. I'm not sure how the most recent conflict is going to be remembered in that dimension, because it was a very small group of people that were called upon to do things that were of strategic impact. But in Fehrenbach's book, This Kind of War, he was trying to say, look, we have to be ready for the next one, we have to be ready for the next one. And things that come out of that people have forgotten is like all these monuments you see. If you go around, you see the National Guard armories, you'll see the tank out front. In 1951, they were tearing those tanks off of the monuments and putting them on trains and putting engines back into them because the United States had no capacity to do the war that had just started. And we read that book and we go, wow, that was really bad. Now what? And we have this institutional Alzheimer's. And I don't know, maybe that's what all writers hope for, is that no one will remember. This has been said 1,000 times for 7,000 years. That's my thought.
Yeah, I think that at the end of the war, however you define it, obviously defining the ends of these wars becomes a much murkier endeavor. There's a struggle for narrative, and I think we're seeing that right now. The narrative, everything from the Lone Survivor movies to books like Billy Lynn's Long Half-Time Walk. There's definitely a real variety in the narrative that's coming out of these wars, but I think it's natural that people want to understand what they've just gone through and have that experience be an informed one. I think what will be interesting about these wars is that they look different. And it's the first time this country's gone to war with an all-volunteer army. It's the first time there's been a war that's been financed through deficit spending, so the American people haven't really felt it in the way they've felt many of our other wars. And so, it's as much as there's some very recognizable war narratives, I think what you're starting to see come out of these wars are actually a lot of very contradictory points of view. From folks who are very, very proud of the war to folks who are taking over more of an elegiac tone. And I think all of those views are valid. So I think there's going to be a lot of different perspectives on what's happened in the last 10 years and, what's happening right now, because the wars are not over. If you go to Iraq today, that war is not over. And the same Iraqis who were fighting it in 2004 are now fighting it 10 years later.
So how can literature take a role in explaining these things that for most civilians are very are big black holes, like Special Operations Forces or like the intelligence community. And Bob, maybe you can talk a little bit about how growing up in McLean, you got an interest in that, and even though you didn't serve in the military, felt drawn to try and understand these cultures and describe them in a different way, in a way that they weren't being described in, say, the New York Times, with complete respect to anyone from the New York Times who may be here tonight.
Yeah, Dexter Filkins did a pretty good job. You know, how can you do a better job than those guys did? I don't know how that happens. One thing I know from speaking at my parents' American Legion Hall on Friday nights, the first time they dragged me there, oh my God, your son, and he's been in war zones, let's make him get up and talk. And I had to remind the people, you know, a crowd like this, having their dinner at American Legion on Friday night, that, you know, you guys aren't the only ones who shed blood for your country, who serve your country in a way that involves risk and danger and bloodshed. And in fact, half the people in that American Legion had never seen combat. And, you know, the per capita deaths of journalists, and put them together with Peace Corps volunteers who also shed blood for their country, not so much, but, you know, per capita it's proportionately significant and not to be forgotten, and you don't see memorials to those people. But to get back to your question, I grew up in McLean, Virginia. McLean, Virginia houses the CIA. Part of McLean is called Langley, that's where the CIA is. And everybody I went to high school with, their parents worked for the CIA. And all of our parents were running the world. And it was just normal, you know, to have your dad go over to Vietnam to reorganize their Navy, which my dad did. He was a Catholic Cold War warrior. He was a zealot Catholic Cold War warrior. And, you know, so I grew up, I was in the NRA when I was 9 years old, and I would go to the shooting range at Fort Myers, and their basement shooting range, and I'd have all my cool medals for being, you know, this killer marksman, and that I grew up in the world of the PX and admirals and generals. They were all around me. But my dad was a civilian, and of course I'm not a veteran the way that Elliot and Tony are. You know, to grow up in that world was utterly fascinating. And when I wrote this book, it's a murder mystery. And well, number one, murder mystery. Everybody knows about murder mysteries. Murder is America's most favorite form of entertainment. So I didn't really have to research anything there. But espionage, thriller, and war story, those things that's what I know. I really do. I know it from growing up in McLean. And I know from my father dropped out of the seminary 6 months before he was to be ordained as a Catholic priest. And we're Lithuanian, so there's the Eastern European, anti-Soviet sort of stuff working there. But, you know, when the Soviet Union collapsed,